And in this market, foresight isn't a luxury. It is your competitive edge.
If you could give 3 pieces of advice to someone in a procurement team now around making sure you're always kind of switched on and you're resilient, 3 pieces of advice, what would they be?
Sitting idle is really just giving up the leverage and letting others capture the advantage. Budgets are not static. The market isn't static either. So the smarter shippers, what they do is that they don't treat budget as some kind of stone tablets, right? They treat them as living documents.
Welcome to The Freight Debate, the ultimate destination for supply chain professionals, logistics leaders, and anyone who's ever wondered what really keeps the world moving. I'm Phil Hennessy, and in today's episode, we're going to challenge the notion of freight intelligence platforms simply being a tool shippers use during a, inverted commas, tender season, because we might need to clarify what tender seasons are, because freight procurement doesn't stop when the tender closes, and the smartest shippers know it. Talking of smart shippers, we're delighted to welcome Peter Sundara Swamickannu to the Freight Debate. And Peter's going to hopefully share some real-world examples of shippers who have got ahead of the game by acting outside of the kind of, again, inverted commas, traditional tender window. Before we can hand over to Peter, but I'll give you a bit of a background as to why we're so pleased that he's joining us on the Freight Debate. Peter has nearly 3 decades of international experience across major shipping lines and logistics providers. That includes Maersk, P&O Nedlloyd, Agility, Flexport, Scan Global Logistics, LF Logistics, and he specialises in operations, trade management, and digital supply chain transformation. Currently, Peter leads global ocean freight product at one of the largest BCOs located in Singapore, which is also a world leader in its industry. His career has taken him Australia, Taiwan, Hong Kong, the UK, Vietnam, and he's a huge advocate for innovation. And he's also co-authored The World's Thought Leaders, a collection of insights from global pioneers shaping the future of supply chain and logistics industry. Wow, wow, wow. What a welcome, Peter.
Oh, thanks, Phil. I'm still learning. I'm still on the learning curve, Phil. At the end of the day, I'm still learning every day.
If put it this way, if I can't get some good insights out of you today, Peter, then I might hang up my microphone and give up.
Yeah, we'll go through, mate. We'll share as much as I can. No problem.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. As I say, thank you. I'm really looking forward to this one. So let's not waste any more time. Let's get into the questions. As we say, freight kind of never sleeps now, does it? And we don't kind of have this kind of traditional tender season. But when we talk about the use of freight intelligence around tender seasons, I suppose this can be helpful when the rates are high or, our budgets are under pressure. But from your kind of first-hand experience, what's the cost of waiting until tender season to engage with these kind of freight benchmarking tools? What are shippers missing out by not having this kind of year-round, almost 24/7 approach to freight tendering?
Good question again, Phil. First of all, whatever I'm going to share is purely my personal view. It doesn't reflect anything on my company, right? Okay. All right. One of the things that I've, through my experience, that we cannot wait till the tender season to come and you start then negotiating. Because to me, if you do that, you are basically looking for disasters, all right? I believe that freight management, it shouldn't be a last-minute survival thing. It should be about planning the flight path, right? If you wait until rates are sky high or the budget alarms start ringing, you're already late for the party. In my view, procurement is not just about freight. It's about ensuring continuity and credibility for the business. What we can do is think of it as keeping the engine running, right? You don't just hunt for the cheapest fuel, right? What we need to do is that you need to look at systems, freight management systems such as Zenitha, at any point of time, and make sure that you do not miss out the real opportunity of using the data to time your conversation with the carriers or with the freight forwarders when the market is actually in your favor, right? So what I would do is that, especially for Zenitha or any other freight benchmarking you do, is that you look at this freight benchmarking tool as a year-round freight barometer. You must stay proactive and not reactive. You must move from being hindsight to being foresight. And in this market, foresight isn't a luxury. It is your comparative edge. So therefore, what we need to worry about is that we don't simply check the weather only when it's raining, right? We check it whether to bring an umbrella or not. So procurement is not only activated during a crisis. If you do that, it's not a strategy. It's basically damage control. So therefore, procurement will have to be done at every point of time, not only towards the closer period of the tender period. That's my view based on my experience so far.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it's always raining where I'm from, Peter, so I don't even
need That's a good one, man.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And maybe kind of it is a bit of a mindset change to go to this kind of always on freight procurement approach. But when you frame it in the way that you've just framed it, it's surprising that anyone wouldn't take this approach, considering everyone's always striving for this competitive edge, aren't they? It's kind of these small marginal gains that kind of all build to give you that competitive advantage. But obviously, you have this kind of operational experience, on the front line, as it were. Could you give us an example of when you saved money or gained leverage when you've negotiated outside of the kind of traditional tender season?
That's a very good question, I feel. I mean, absolutely right. Because one of the things that I use every day as a Bible when I come to the office is to use Zenitha, right? Because end of the day, Zenitha to me makes a difference. There was a time when the market rates were dropping significantly in the mid-cycle, right? Instead of waiting for the next tender season, what I did was I used the data and go after the providers. Because at the end of the day, with the data, you're able to renegotiate and lock in servings, not by unlocking the current contract you have, but going after and see, can we now look into a new quarterly rates? I'll give you an example, right? You look at the current Asia, Europe, or Asia, US rates, they are plummeting. The long-term contracts we have in now is no longer in line with the falling freight levels. But if you look at use Zenitha as a freight benchmarking platform, you can clearly see the gap between the long-term contracts and the current spot rates. So that's why what we did was we used that information and we ship volume into a spot market or even come out with a monthly deal or a quarterly deal with the carriers. And this is how we take advantage of downturns and reap the real cost efficiency. So the key is all about leverage, right? Because at the end of the day, carriers and freight forwarders, they respect shippers when you come with data, not just with gut feelings. So therefore, with Zenitha, what I do is that the conversation is like from this is what I want to this is where the market is. And that's powerful. And that's how it works well outside the tender season.
Yeah. And presumably you mentioned the spread there between long and spot. And that's just one example of the kind of intelligence that's so powerful in negotiations. But presumably having that understanding, when you actually do put pen to paper and you sign that contract, then actually from a budget point of view, we're kind of in budget period now for 2026. If you don't get that right, then the work that you're doing on budgets for 2026 now, you kind of throw it, you've put it in the trash, do you not? Because you get it wrong, So if you're in this kind of budget season now, it hinges on this more robust freight procurement strategy.
Totally, yeah. One of the things that we need to understand as the shipper is that we need to make sure that the budget are not set with a crystal ball, right? They should be set with real-time data. That's important. And with freight benchmarking tools such as Zenitha, you're not budgeting based on guesswork or last year's averages, right? You're basically using live benchmarks that reflects what's happening on the major trades, Asia, Europe, Asia, US, or wherever you ship. That makes your 2026 budget far more realistic from the very start, right? So here's the real trick, right, Phil? Budgets are not static. The market isn't static either. So the smarter shippers, what they do is that they don't treat budget as some kind of stone tablets, right? They treat them as living documents. And with platforms such as Zenitha, you can basically track the shift throughout the year and adjust before a small gap turns into a big miss. And also, it's very easy to explain to your CFO, right? If your CFO asks you why suddenly millions of dollars are off the market, you can say, look, we saw the trend coming, we course corrected. And that builds credibility in the procurement. And honestly, it saves a lot of awkward conversation in the boardroom. So therefore, the way I see compare budget is that a budget without real-time data is just like bringing an old weather forecast to a picnic. You definitely get wet.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Because we always talk about these topics at a business level, in terms of the business will save whatever percent in the next freight contract or whatever it is. But within a business of human beings, all with their individual jobs and all with their individual responsibilities. So I imagine if you don't have that data, just from a personal kind of point of view, you think, oh, I wish I had that data. You would, though, wouldn't you? Because if your CFO knocks on your door and you don't have anything, it's like, we're all the same, aren't we? In this world, in many respects, you want to be able to justify your own kind of role in your own work and your own kind of output. You can't do it, can you? It's an awkward conversation if you don't have that data.
Exactly, mate. I mean, also when it comes to budget, it's not only about the volume, right? They also want to measure your revenue, right? And how do you project a revenue if you don't know what the rate levels are going to be? So that's where platforms such as Zenitha comes in. They gives you the projection of what the potential revenue the rates are going through, right? So then that provide credibility when I put forward the proposal to my CFO, right? That's where data makes just imagine a feel like if you don't have data, how do you project your budgets, both your volume and revenue? It's an impossible task. So that's why now with data, our arguments, our figures have much more credibility in terms of what we put forward to our finance directors.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We're talking here about, we've talked about budgets and we've talked about freight rates, long and spot spread and such like. What there's more to freight procurement than just the kind of all-in rate, whether it's spot or long. And that comes down to the operational aspects, whether it's transit times or reliability or whatever that may be. And we've seen it, haven't we, with the kind of maelstrom of carnage in supply chains in the last 12 months or so, or more than that. So how does this also feed into your procurement strategy? How do you use data to factor in all of those non kind of rate factors?
Let's take the two examples you just mentioned, transit time reliability, right? They may be often labeled as operational issues, but in reality, they are critical procurement levers. If your cargo is constantly late or transit take longer than promised, it's not just only an inconvenience, it's a cost, it's a risk, and potentially a lost customer. So procurement teams who ignore these are leaving money and credibility on the table. Let's take an example, right? I have a customer who ships from Haiphong to US West Coast. They need direct service because to meet the deadlines of new lines of clothing for summer. By using platforms such as Zenitha's data on transit time and service reliability, we can identify which carriers are constantly hitting the mark. That allows the procurement to negotiate contract not just on price, but also on performance, securing capacity with the carriers who deliver on time and giving the business some kind of certainty is very imperative. So in short, right, good procurement is more than about rates. It's how you align your operation reality with commercial strategy. And behind this, the power is data. Data provides you the power to make decisions because if you can quantify reliability, you can contract it. That is a fantastic outcome end of the day. To put in an analogy, right, if you ignore transit reliability, it's just like buying a sports car, but you're not testing or checking the brakes.
Yeah. No, it makes absolute sense. And if we look at the way that the rates have been impacted by operational kind of factors. So, for example, congestion in kind of mid last year, where we had when rates went skywards. They spiraled, didn't they? And that's because shippers are reacting and they're worried about, as you say, making sure their goods are on the shelves or the parts are in the factory, and they're going, oh my God, we've got another major incident. I need to front load goods. But presumably, don't get me wrong, there's going to be nervousness in the wake of a major incident like Red Sea or whatever. But I suppose if you have a contract that you feel really confident in, and you have a supplier relationship that's strong, and you know what you are actually contracted to receive, whether it's transit times, and you have confidence in your supplier to do that, presumably in the wake of these big incidents, it helps, and you don't have to. You can use data to react accordingly rather than panic, basically.
Totally, mate. Yeah, and you're absolutely spot on, I feel, and that means that you need to have a basket or a group of providers who are reliable and you have strong relationship with them, right? Not it's every time, right? The strong relationship doesn't only happens during good times, but more importantly, you need them during bad times, such as a heavy chronic congestion in the market.
Yeah. Could I just ask you a question on that, actually? Because I always get the feel, I've clearly not been involved in the kind of, on the ground as you are. But it always feels like carriers would say, well, there's Red Sea, so we're putting the rates up, peak season surcharge or Red Sea surcharge, whatever it is. And that's kind of like, oh, well, that's fair enough. But a shipper can go to a carrier, can't they, and say, hang on a minute, in the event of a large-scale return to the Red Sea, or, front loading's ease, so why are you putting a peak season surcharge on? But it's not wrong for a shipper to challenge a carrier if they've got the data to back up their decision, right? It's a two-way street, isn't it? And that comes back to that strong relationship. Pushing back on a carrier, presumably, that means you have a strong relationship to do so, right? Is that right?
Correct. Totally, mate, right? Because when you come with data, right, the carriers know that, okay, what this particular shipper is telling is he's not looking at gut feelings, he's looking real data and putting that explanation through with real hard facts. And then this shipper knows the market well, and he's basically supporting his argument with the data. And that creates credibility for the shipper in front of the carrier. And that is part and parcel of procurement, right? If you don't have that data, I tell you, it could be like my gut feeling. How much the gut feeling can go into the procurement strategy? It will not help the shipper in any way. That's where data has become so important for us now, I feel.
It must feel good. Does it feel good when you...
I'm telling you, it feels so good, right?
Yeah,
exactly. It feels so good because now I have more confidence to tell the shipper, look, guys, or the carrier, look, what you're doing in terms of putting a GR, for example, doesn't work because the rate levels are dropping. Look at what Zenitha provides, for example. And the carriers will say, okay, I will talk to my trade again. And they come back. Yes, Peter, you're right. Rates are going down. We'll now reduce the GR, something along the line. Previously, we can't do that. Now with data, they cannot. And I know that the carriers are also using the same kind of platform that I'm using. All right. So there's already a synergy between both of us. So you can't run away from it, mate.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
you can't run away from it.
Mic drop moment. Put your pen down and sit back and just wait for the rate to drop. So going back to kind of continuing the carrier line, and we've mentioned the long and spot spread. When you're approaching procurement, how do you approach allocating across providers or alliances or however it is, and how do you decide what volumes to put on long and what volumes to put on short?
Deciding how much volume you want to allocate per carrier or alliances isn't just a spreadsheet exercise, right? It's a balancing act, and data is our compass in that respect. We look at multiple factors. We look at comparative rates. We look at the fixed allocation that is given to us. We look at reliability of the carrier. We look at transit time. We also look at the equipment availability. Can I give you an example, right? A carrier might offer you the great rate, one of the fantastic rate. But if their transit time are inconsistent, or equipment is scarce, over-allocating volume will lead to delay and unhappy customers. Conversely, if you pay a slightly higher rate to a highly reliable service with guaranteed space and guaranteed equipment, It can save money and it can save headaches down the stream. So therefore, data allows us to quantify this trade-off and make informed decisions, right? Rather than just simply guessing. So therefore, it's about optimizing the entire network, not only chasing after the lowest cost. So it's like, in the end, right, it's like conducting an orchestra, right? You have carriers, you have freight forwarders, and if lanes. Everyone has a role to play, and data ensures they play in harmony. So it is not just about who's cheapest, but who shows up on time with the right instrument. Because at the end of the day, if you don't have data, it's just like allocating volume. It's like throwing spaghetti at the wall and hoping it sticks.
Yeah. And presumably that approach will throw up some surprises. Has there been instances where kind of anecdotally you'll hear people say, that carrier, not on that lane, no, not too sure, they're not great. Or there'll be other carriers that kind of, you think, I bet that carrier's bang on that lane. But actually the data may actually show that it's not quite as clear cut as that. Does it throw up some surprises around carrier performance?
It throws so much of surprise sometimes, right? So sometimes you see on data, okay, this carrier is performing well, but due to many changes, right? Because most of the carriers now operating in alliances, it may not be their carrier, but their partner's carrier may get into delays, right? So you're right. There will be some cases where exceptional happens, and that's where we may have to be very swift enough to change your allocation immediately, but it may not take immediately to change your allocation, but you need to work through and some backup plans, all right? You're absolutely right. Data may not show you the true story, but end of the day, I would safely say 70 to 80% data help us to make the right choices in how allocation is being distributed among the carriers I work with.
And you might have got it wrong if you hadn't, which is the kind of, we're talking the positive side, but the negative side is if you otherwise you would have maybe gone with a carrier that meant your T-shirts weren't. Exactly.
We cannot operate in a foolproof environment, right? Because there are changes that are beyond our control. So if you can achieve 70 to 80% of your allocation on a carrier who has provided reliability, I think that's a big plus for you, all right? And the other 20%, you have to manage exceptions.
Yeah. Pivoting slightly now, Peter, to tariffs, because we've talked about this kind of disruption, haven't we? So, I mean, it's put sourcing certainly and supply chains into this kind of tumble dryer, hasn't it?
Yeah.
In 2025, in terms of trying to react to it. How are you using scenario planning in your freight procurement, trying to understand, all the different potential connotations of and impacts and knock-on effects and ripples across the world because of tariffs? That must make procurement even more complex, and maybe even more important that you do it year round rather than trying to cram, trying to predict the next 12 months geopolitical trajectory in now, which clearly would be ridiculous, wouldn't it?
One thing I'm blessed is that, in Singapore, most of the male above the age of 18, we serve national service, serve the army. And one of the things that officers like me we learn a lot of scenario planning, all right? So that exercise, that experience in the army really helped me in my procurement, right? So in the current tariff and global sourcing, you can see that it's changing very, very fast. And if you do not stress test your supply chain, you're walking blind. So in my scenario, or in my cases on day-to-day, we use a lot of scenario planning to model different outcomes. What happens if the tariff spikes? What happens if a supplier delays? Or what happens if the key lane becomes congested? So therefore, it is important for procurement professional like myself to use data, for example, from Zenitha, to lay in front of us what is the real-time freight rates, what's the transit times, what's the carrier performance, to see the ripple effect on the cost and timing. It's not about predicting the future perfectly, right? It's not about that, but it's about understanding the risk and be ready to act. Okay, I'll give you an example, right? If there's a sudden tariff increase hits between Vietnam and USA lanes, so what do we need to do? We need to quickly evaluate all the alternatives. Can we switch carriers? Can we switch volumes? Can we leverage on spot market opportunities? So therefore, scenario planning gives us the foresight to make decisions in a calm manner instead of reacting under pressure. And in this market, believe me, calm beats chaos anytime. So therefore, scenario planning is like running fire drills, right? We hope you will never need them, but if you do, you're always ready.
Yeah, it's a new world, isn't it? That we're operating in. But in terms of tariffs, you can switch suppliers and you can maybe switch sourcing if there's a tariff on Vietnam, which is highly disruptive. But is there a nuance to the tariff situation? Because are there kind of some ways in which I don't want to say they help, but can you? How do I phrase this correctly? Because there'll be people listening going, "Are you being serious? That the tariffs are a good thing." I'm not saying that, just to be absolutely clear.
Yeah.
But I suppose what I'm saying is, when there's massive disruption, does it create opportunities for you to get a competitive edge within a market that is so volatile and so other people aren't reacting as well as you, or your competitors aren't reacting as well as you?
My personal view is this, right? In fact, the tariff is basically a blessing in disguise for those people operating out of Asia, right? From Asia, we look at things differently, right? We see more opportunities that has been cropping up in other trades besides US. We see an increase in intra-Asia volumes from China into India, or even within China into Southeast Asia. We see increase in volumes to Latin America from Asia, increase in volume to Middle East, to Africa, and even to Europe. That has come about because the shippers in Asia, they're very pragmatic, all right? Especially the freight forwarders too. They're very pragmatic. If you see tariff keep on increasing or there's uncertainty in the tariff for shipment to the US, they look at other opportunities. And that's how Asia has become much more important for many of us, where we start look at other opportunities besides the USA. I'll give you an example, right? When the US and China had the tariff, and the Chinese retaliated and imposed a huge tariff on import of beef, right? What happened is that the Chinese then started importing beef from Australia, because the beef in Australia is still of high quality and very sustainable. That's how they quickly changed. So you see the trade between Australia and China increased. Another example is the steel. When the US imposed a tariff on steels out from Vietnam, what the Vietnamese shippers did, move the steels from Vietnam into Australia, because Australia is going through a booming construction industry. So you can see how trade pattern moves and look for the best opportunity they have. So freight is like water. They will look for the best opportunity. So from my point of view, the freight tariff has created a new opportunity for us to look at other avenues. And Asia is benefiting quite a lot from that area.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I suppose the one thing you have to bear in mind is, let's think about South America, East Coast, Far East, South America, East Coast. Let's say, a business says we're gonna ship more goods from Far East, China to South America, East Coast, rather than US, for example. But increasing volumes on that South America, East Coast trade could tighten capacity, couldn't it? If there's more volumes, or we've seen it kind of in the past, massive increases in volumes from China to Mexico rather than US. So it's this shifting global landscape, isn't it? So even if, let's say, you're a shipper in Asia and you already ship large volumes into South America, you could actually, even though you wouldn't be impacted by the tariffs at all, you actually are, aren't you? Because other businesses are getting on your trade lane as well, and and then you have this kind of tightening the capacity, and rates go up and rates go down. So I suppose the point I'm making is, it is global, isn't it? No one is unaffected by these geopolitical issues.
And you're absolutely right, mate. And that's the reason why the carriers also are quite smart, right? They know where the demand is. They started coming up with putting more capacity in this trade. And some carriers, especially the niche carriers, have combined together and provided their own services from Asia to Latin America. So this is all due to the impact of the tariff on new trade lanes opening or increasing capacity in other trades.
and port infrastructure, what's going, I spoke, you can't build a deep water port overnight, can you? So it makes you wonder, doesn't it? How long are these shifting trade patterns going to be long term, and what's the infrastructure and inland transport and all that kind of stuff? It's all highly complex, isn't it?
Exactly,
I don't envy your job, I must say.
Yeah. But your point is very valid, man, because you cannot, like what you said, you cannot basically increase the capacity of ports and terminals, even trucking overnight, right? It will take some time to do it. You're absolutely right.
Again, let's kind of move the conversation on. We do kind of hear some shippers out there, they'll say there's nothing really happening at the moment in terms of, our lanes of, doing what they do. And actually, we're kind of happy with our rate. And, there's my CFO isn't knocking on my door saying what's going on and all, so I'm okay. What would you say to them if, the kind of them?
I heard that a lot, right? Nothing urgent is happening, so just wait. But please remember, right, in supply chain logistics, right, staying still and doing nothing is never in our DNA, right? We are always forward planning, we're looking ahead, we're pushing ourselves for the what's next. So even in a soft market, right, there's always opportunity. For example, I just mentioned earlier, right, carriers are adding extra sailings from Asia to Mexico, Asia to Brazil, or within Asia itself, responding to the shifting demand, right? So therefore, with data, right, you can spot this opportunity very easily, very early, secure space, negotiate the rates, and start positioning your volume where the market reacts, right? That's important. Sitting idle is really just giving up the leverage and letting others capture the advantage. So one thing you need to remember is that volatility is never far away. But we have to stay proactive even when things are calm, because during this period, you are able to secure better rates and negotiate with confidence, right? And you are able to ready to move the moment when the condition shifts. You want to wait. Waiting might make you feel very safe, right? But in our world, action, right, especially guided by data, is what keeps you ahead all the time. So to put your metaphor, right, in logistics, standing still is like trying to surf while sitting on the beach, right? You'll never be able to catch a wave.
And I suppose is there a kind of rhythm to this? You kind of, you get, how do I put it? Your analogies are amazing, by the way. I'll try. I'll try come up with one of myself. But if you've ever broken down in your car, it's really difficult to start. If you try and push your car, it's really difficult to get your car wheels moving. Once you actually get the car moving, it's a lot easier, isn't it? And is it kind of like that with tenders, where actually, if you wait until tender season, you go, right, let's do a tender. And then you start all this and you start gathering data and you start understanding carrier performance and you start kind of stress testing alternatives. You're starting again, you're, oh God. Whereas if you're doing it constantly all year round, yes, you're doing it constantly, but actually you're in a rhythm and you've got momentum. Is it just a way of working, really?
Actually, that's the good way of working, right? Because at the end of the day, when you have this momentum of doing tenders, not only during tender period, it gives you so much of flexibility, it gives you so much of information, and you get used to it, right? You constantly get the mission moving, and that's where many of us benefit from that. So in my work of procurement, right, I have long-term contracts. At the same time, when the time appears, when the time is right, I also negotiate a one-month deal or a short-term contract to provide that flexibility to take advantage of a low season, right? So therefore, you're absolutely right, Phil, right? Tender cannot be purely done during the tender period. It has to be a long line live project, as I say it.
Let's finish what has been, I think, a phenomenal episode of the Freight Debate, Peter. Let's round it off because I'm sure people listening and watching have found it incredibly insightful and helpful. And many of them, I'm sure, are working in procurement teams and live in the same world and the same reality as yourself. So if you could give 3 pieces of advice to someone in a procurement team now around making sure you're always on, you're always kind of switched on and you're resilient, 3 pieces of advice, what would they be?
If I had to give the procurement team 3 pieces of advice for staying ready, right? Not just resilience. This is what I would say, right? Number one, always use real-time data constantly, right? Don't wait for tender seasons or a crisis to check the market. Use platforms such as Zenitha. See your rates, see the transit time, see the carrier performance in real time, and you act proactively and not reactively. That's the first thing I would suggest or give advice to the procurement team. The second thing is that we have to think beyond price. Cost matters, of course, don't get me wrong. Cost always matters, but reliability, transit time, equipment availability, and flexibility are equally critical. A slightly higher rate on a carrier who constantly delivers on time can save us far more than chasing the lowest cost. Finally, the third thing I would like to recommend or give advice to the procurement team is that do scenario planning like a true strategist. Because volatility is inevitable, it's going to stay. Stress test your supply chain, tariff, capacity crunches, port disruptions. Understand the ripple effects beyond they happen so that you can make confident decisions when the market shifts. So in short, right, stay informed, think holistically, and plan ahead. That's how you can move from being resilient, which is basically reacting to shocks, to being truly ready and shaping outcomes.
Amazing. One of the problems with digital, virtual, online podcasts. I wish you could shake your hand, Peter. So I'll have to. I think that's it in a nutshell, isn't it? You know, I mean, it's amazing, and to hear it from someone who kind of lives and breathes it every day, such as yourself. It's incredibly powerful, and I hope our viewers and listeners have found it as interesting as certainly I have. Fantastic, Peter.
Thanks, Nate. At the end of the day, right, being ready isn't about luck, right? It's about knowing the market better than anybody else in the room. And that is where your credibility comes through very clearly in front of the carriers.
Yeah. And again, it must feel really good, Peter. You know, it must be a kind of, you know, in a kind of personal, like, you know, your kind of shoulders are back and you kind of, you know, get a load of this data, isn't it? You
exactly,
know?
Mate. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks.
I think it's been an absolutely phenomenal episode of The Freight Debate. If you have enjoyed this episode of The Freight Debate with Peter, which I'm sure you have, please hit subscribe, like, share, tell your friends, tell your colleagues. It's an amazing episode for them to listen to. So finally, again, Peter, thank you very much for all of your insights. And to all our viewers and listeners, thank you for tuning in again. And we'll see you on the next episode of The Freight Debate. Thank you.
Thanks, Faith. Thank you very much.